Welcome everybody to week 5, and we will be covering chapter 4 this week, which is all about the self and social identity. Here is the to-do list for the week. Let's get to the objectives first off. The self and social identity is really about the person's perception of themselves and how that is embedded within the greater social sphere that they're a part of. So we all have sort of concepts of where we fit and how we fit. It goes beyond just self-esteem and really takes into context where we come from, what groups we're a part of, and how that affects our own self-image. So we're going to be looking at the different dimensions of a person's social identity and the ways that then can be influenced by the context in which the person is in. So, for example, we have different parts of ourselves that get activated or sort of come alive depending upon the environment that we're in or who we're around at the time. We'll look at some different tactics that we use when we socially present ourselves. So when we are within a group of people, we might want to present ourselves a certain way. Take, for instance, people we work with versus people who are our best friends versus people who are just our classmates. These are all different settings, and we're going to present in various ways depending upon that setting. It touches on elements of introspection, as I have here, which is a very kind of Freudian concept, but really it's just looking within oneself. How do we do that? How do we use that out in the greater sort of social world? And we cannot forget that social identity is really based on the comparisons that we're making with other people. How do we know how we're doing and where we fit unless we know how other people are doing and where they fit and where we are in comparison to them? So it really takes into account not just the person's introspective level, but relative to their peers and the social comparisons that they're making. So we will touch a little bit on self-esteem and how that plays a role in that social comparison process. What are ways that we use social comparison that help us versus hurt us, and how can that be affected by, say, who we're friends with or the types of settings that we put ourselves in. And we'll look at how we measure that. So as social psychologists and researchers, how does one measure a person's sense of self within that greater sphere? We'll be looking at some different biases we have. I mean, we've already laid the foundation for understanding how we use our biases when we looked at social cognition. We took a look at, sort of the role that these biases play in our judgment and in our decision making. So it goes without saying that we're definitely going to use that as well when we're observing ourselves and when we are judging ourselves. So we'll get into low versus high self-esteem, some gender differences there, and then really into some of the theory on social comparison. How do we use it? How is it good? How can it be damaging? And then the various tactics that we employ to protect our sense of self or our self-esteem. We'll be looking at a concept called self-monitoring, those who are low and high in self-monitoring, and that actually has to do with the article for this week. You're going to be talking about high versus low self-monitors and really how that affects how we interact with other people, and what that might say for parts of our personality and how that plays a role as well. So it'll be really tying in a lot of the different homeworks that we've been looking at so far. We'll be kind of building on some of that. So you've got your article reading, you've got the lecture slides. I did put in a couple very short video clips. These are couple minutes each. Self in a Digital World, and then Dove Beauty, Sketch Artist. Neither of these do you have to submit or turn anything in for, but I do want you to read them because they build on the concepts that we're talking about in the text this week, and give you good illustrations of how you might see some of those concepts kind of playing out in the real world. As we get into the discussion this week, you'll be looking at Article 13. I think up here I have the old article from last week, so I'll get rid of that. But we're focusing on Article 13 and Chapter 4. So remember, when you're responding to the discussion questions, you should be integrating not only the article, but also the chapter, because the chapter is sort of what provides the base that includes all the concepts for understanding then the core issue that the article talks about. So for example, this week the article is about high and low self-monitoring. How would somebody who's high versus somebody who's low in self-monitoring act differently depending upon the setting? So I want you to pick a setting. You can pick whichever one you'd like: a first date, a job interview, a team sport, or a family gathering. And then I want you to illustrate how a person who's a low self-monitor might interact in that setting, and how someone who's a high self-monitor might act in that setting. And you're going to want to use the concepts from the article and from the chapter to help build your case to show me that you understand the difference and are able to pull out some examples to support your statements. So just make sure that you're doing a good job at integrating both of those sources. And then we do have an exam this week. It's going to close by the 6th of October. Yes, we are in October already. And so you want to make sure that you are leaving enough time before the exam shuts to complete it. The exam closes automatically at 11:59 p.m. So if you are starting the exam at, say, 11:40, you're not leaving yourself much time. In fact, you're only leaving yourself 19 minutes to finish the test, because it will automatically shut down at 11:59. So just keep that in mind. It's 30 questions, and you have 30 minutes to complete the test. It is meant to be a little challenging, and that is the nature of the exam. If I teach this in person, which I am, I have an in-person class as well, they take a 50-question test, and they have 50 minutes. So it's very similar. Content covered is, not exactly the same, but it gives you an idea of kind of what the caliber is set at in terms of that. But again, definitely to prepare for that test, you can be using Revel. So Revel has practice tests on there. If you haven't already, check that out. I really highly recommend it. I've noticed I can see who's logged in and who hasn't, number of views, number of usage for tests, and I see that a lot of people aren't using it. And that's really kind of shooting yourself in the foot, because it's a resource you have that you're paying for, and it can really help with exams. And that's not my feedback, that's student feedback. Every student I've had that uses the Revel resources say that they're really helpful. So I would suggest taking the exams for the chapters before you start that exam. So chapters 3 and 4 are going to be covered on this exam. And, go ahead and preview those practice tests before you start the actual test. That would be a good idea. And definitely you can be using these objectives here, making sure that you're understanding fully what you need to before you're going in and diving into that test. You really need to be focusing on the chapter and the readings, and understanding sort of how everything's relating. So the book is set up in a way that it builds upon itself, chapter by chapter. So, the things that we've covered already, even in chapter 1, research methods, it's all applicable. It helps you to understand then in chapter 4, the self, concepts that are helpful for looking at that. And when we're talking about the self and how we view ourselves and how others view us, we're building off of the heuristic information we learned. We're building off of social perception content that we learned. So it all is helpful to kind of keep that in mind, sort of get a step outside it for a minute and get a bigger sort of broader view of it before you dive into the nitty gritty. Okay, so I think that pretty much covers the week. Please let me know if you have questions, and definitely be looking at my feedback that I give you on your discussion posts. This past week was much better. People doing much better on just integrating the material into their posts, as well as commenting on other people. So I'm seeing definite strides just, and that was week 3 material. So as I'm getting prepared to grade your next week's discussion post, be looking for that feedback kind of midweek is what I shoot for. And then just let me know if you have any questions. Okay? Have a good week, everybody. Thanks.